ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the second day of Inaugural Conference of Che Institute for Advanced Studies, titled U.S.-China-Korea Trilateral Conference. We will begin session 4, titled Towards a New Strategy in the Transition of Northeast Asia. This session will be moderated by President SOHN of East Asia Institute. Please welcome 5 distinguished speakers and the moderator to the stage.
Thank you very much. My name is SOHN from the East Asia Institute and the Yonsei University. I'm honored to be able to moderate on this very, very important panel. As you see in the title of the panel, it's New Strategy. So what we will discuss this morning is not just about North Korean nuclear issue, it's about the future of Northeast Asia and how we, including US, China, and Korea, and North Korea included, will chart a new course for the peace and prosperity of North Korea in Northeast Asia in the future. We have 5 distinguished scholars and experts from 3 countries. I think we need no introduction for that. Let me just start off with a few remarks on this panel. As I said, it is designed to explore a new strategy. It's kind of a bold strategy. And in that sense, it's kind of wide open discussion for each 3 countries and North Korea, and we will do that in times of transition. That is title of this conference, and that means that figure out a new strategy in the changing regional environments that are in transition. Let me say a few words about the transition we can think of. One is obviously transition of power in the region. So we can say from United States to China. Not so clear, but the Chinese GDP will most likely catch up with the United States in a decade or so, depending on your measurement. Some say it's 2029 to 2034, 35. So it's only a decade ahead. And from now to that point, we can think of what would happen. And historically and also theoretically, we can see in this time sort of U.S.-China conflict or rivalries in the region. That on the one hand, the rising power who is not satisfied with the existing order try to delegitimate the existing authority and prestige of the established power and the order. So that's one aspect of sort of source of change. And on the other hand, established power will make efforts to deter the rise of a new power, or try to slow down the pace of the rise. And we see a lot of speculations, theoretically and historically examined. And then here, Northeast Asia and Korean Peninsula, what would happen if those things occur, particularly in the Korean Peninsula during, the denuclearization process, negotiation process, how that process will be impacted by the increasing rivalry between the 2 great powers, and also the after what would occur, in Korean Peninsula after a peace treaty is signed. So that's one source of challenge from the transition. And the second is we can think of, I think Professor Hyug Im touched upon that. It's about from the transition from globalization to post-globalization. Most likely we talk about the anti-global or illiberal forces emerging in the world. I don't need to elaborate all these points, but clearly the backlash of globalization will create, is creating income inequality, rising income inequality, social polarization, political polarization, debacles, and that leads to populist politics in advanced industrial countries. And in that sense, Northeast Asia is not an exception, not immune to that trends. So that populists, here mostly based on the nationalist appeal flavor, occurs in the region, and foreign policy, in that sense, is very much domestically oriented, inward-looking, taking care of popularity in the domestic scene, and that happens and occurs at a time when more effective international coordination, cooperation, and governance are needed. And that which leads to our third point of transition, I would say the rise of identity politics in Northeast Asia. We all know that here the regional environment, like North Korean threats, and also challenges from Trump trade policies that we discussed, that would bring Japan and Korea, for example, two status quo democracies and trading powers, closer together, but reality is not. So, we see the rise of identity conflicts between Japan and Korea, Korea and China and Japan, not to mention. So all these can be understood, not just in terms of what Abe does, what Moon does for the other party, but more in a structural way. So a new strategy, I think, needs to be formulated under the changing environment in the region in times of transition. So with that said, I once again would like to hear from our panelists that what it's not about how to resolve North Korean problems. Yes, we can discuss that, but more toward the future of Northeast Asia and how we, deal with, the challenges that you think, and how we, formulate new thinking and strategies. With that said, from my left, Ambassador GALLUCCI. In that order, I think, once again, I don't really need to introduce the detail. So would you want to start? And I will give you, let's say, 12 minutes to give your thoughts on the first round. And then we may go to the second round within the panel, and then open the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to, as everyone else has, and properly so, congratulate Chairman Che for the CIIS and President Pak for the conference we have, and I want to express my gratitude for being included in this event. I need to confess here that I had planned on reading you a speech this morning for my 12 minutes. Here it is. It's actually not bad. But it after yesterday seems irrelevant to me. I brought it with me so that Incook would know that I'd done my homework, but not terribly well. So I've got another set of comments which have me try to address the problem. And the chairman just spoke to the problem. The title of this panel, A New Strategy for Transition in Northeast Asia. On the one hand, that seems to push us towards yet another conversation about North Korea in Northeast Asia, and whether we can find a reconciliation between the North and the South, whether the U.S. can normalize relations with the DPRK. But it also pushes us toward another set of comments that were topical yesterday, and that is the U.S.-China competition, the question of a rising power, a falling power, a change, and I use this as a term of art, in the international structure. And I say this a tad flippantly, Graham Allison's newest crusade, and that is the question of, as he said, the Thucydides trap, with a book title, Destined for War. Can the United States and China manage this change in the international structure in the Asia-Pacific region? It seems to me that the two topics, the North Korea topic and the U.S.-China topic, are connected. But for policymakers, not so much. Policymakers will break them out, and I think they will usefully break them out as the short-term problem and the long-term problem. And relatively speaking, the North Korea case is the short-term problem. My takeaway on the North Korea issue is that this short-term, relatively short-term problem is manageable, and it's manageable short of war. Perhaps there is indeed a roadmap of corresponding actions or reciprocal actions or action for action in which the DPRK does things related to the nuclear weapons and ballistic missile program, and the United States and others do things with respect to normalization of relations and relief from sanctions. There is a view, probably in this room, certainly in Washington, that that won't work. And it won't work because, and now I quote any number of my colleagues, North Korea will never give up nuclear weapons. So maybe this will not work as I just described it. So there's, as Bob Einhorn used the phrases, there's a roadmap to nowhere, possibly, and that we may not get there. That's possible. It's also possible that we could get there, and that we ought to try. It might not be possible even if the United States is prepared genuinely to normalize relations with North Korea. And that's a question, particularly with North Korean human rights policies, and provide the sanctions relief. And if the Republic of Korea, Japan, and China would provide the economic incentives through investment, it might be true that the North Koreans will still resist what we would call true denuclearization. That leads us to the question of what do we do with that? How do we live? How do we live with North Korea with nuclear weapons without legitimizing North Korea with nuclear weapons, on the one hand, or on the other hand, not slipping into a situation in which it looks prudent for the United States to launch preventive war or to start a second Korean War? The answer to that, I think we actually have lived as well as we know, and the answer to that is we contain. It's not a brilliant strategy, it's not a subtle strategy, but it means that we manage provocations, whether they occur at sea or on land, and we take special care of the alliance. For us, it means the United States will avoid such things as selling out an ally at the negotiating table and focusing just on the vulnerability of the United States to ICBMs while ignoring the vulnerability of its allies to MRBMs, IRBMs, and nuclear weapons in the region. And our allies will avoid selling out their ally when they talk about peace regimes, peace regimes that mean in the first instance the removal of American forward presence in Northeast Asia, including the Korean Peninsula. So in other words, we manage this situation through sustaining credible deterrence and extended deterrence. We protect our alliances. None of this strikes me as conceptually difficult to manage and not very questionable. It all makes sense to me and may work. The long-term policy problem is far more daunting. And I think we had this little bit of a discussion of this yesterday. Things are bad in both Washington and in Beijing with respect to the competition, but maybe a little worse in Washington, although I don't know that for sure. I would be happy to be instructed on this. China is not for the policy community in Washington. China is not a candidate any longer for persuasion to becoming a responsible stakeholder. It is viewed, I think, quite clearly as a revisionist power, a growing power that will surpass in many parameters the United States of America. It is at least a strategic rival, and we are either on the edge of or already into a Cold War. Yesterday, it was said, I think, nicely, that we are not yet enemies. I don't think we're very far from becoming enemies. I don't mean in a de jure sense. I mean in a de facto sense. Enemies without going to war. If we look at indicators of this, there are two obvious ones that are very important in terms of prescription. And one is perception, and that is the perception that what each side does is viewed by the other side in the worst possible light in terms of threat. And the second thing is domestic politics. And again, I know a lot less about China than I do the United States, but in the United States, there's very little credible ground any longer for someone taking the position that they wish to explain the situation from the Chinese perspective and to be taken seriously. That's becoming not a very popular proposition, even for people who classically would have done that. So the question then is, it's an Allison-type question. If we're on the edge of or in Cold War, how do we avoid slipping into hot war? I would suggest you read Allison on the topic, but I would start by saying that we need to recognize the implications of calling this a structural change. That means there's a genuine power shift in the international system in the way we typically, or IR theorists typically measure power. And that has implications. It means below the level of structural power that there are real differences in governance between China and the United States, between the place each has or holds for individual liberties and for human rights, individual human rights in the system, and for a commitment to truly a market-driven economy. Most important here, I think, is that we must understand that we are talking about the collision not of nations that have simple sovereignty to protect, but of empires that have extended peripheries to protect. That therefore their grand strategies, the grand strategies of empires, lead to a kind of conflict that nation states need not engage in. Much easier to imagine and to manage the nation state than the empire. A long time ago in another universe, Strobe Talbot once talked about the changes that Russia had to manage when it, as a failing power, slipped out of the status of a Soviet Union and another part of a bipolar world and became a country that needed to come to grips with a political change from a totalitarian state to a democracy, an economic change from a command economy to a market economy, and the most important, the psychological change from empire to nation. It's a question of where the Russians are, particularly on the third these days. I think the issue here is drawn that way for China and the United States. What I'm trying to say, most important for me anyway, is that to use a phrase from a movie from I think the 1960s, where the character says about another character, what we have here is a failure to communicate, right? What I'm trying to say is, do not look at the U.S.-China relationship as one in which there is a failure to communicate. There may be some failures to communicate, but that's fundamentally what this is not about. This is about a clash of grand strategies of empires. What do we do about this? The good news is that neither side, neither China nor the United States, wants to move from Cold War to hot war. They don't want war. We start, therefore, or I would say we should start in a place in which, amazingly, we're doing very little to nothing, and that is true arms control. We're pretty experienced at that from the experience with the Soviet Union, and it may be that the people in Beijing are not interested in repeating the Cold War experience and getting into arms control negotiations with the United States, but I do think that is one way to manage one of the most dangerous parts of our competition. And I think second, crises. I think one of the points that Allison makes is that as he looks back into 500 years of history, rising powers and declining powers have clashed because a conflict has been sparked by a crisis someplace else. And we have a couple of places in the Asia-Pacific region that are candidates for that. One would be the Korean Peninsula, and another would be Taiwan. They're not the only ones. We have incidents at sea, we have other kinds of things. But I think a focus in these two areas early on would be prudent. Finally, Mr. Chairman, I would note that there's a tendency, at least in the United States, I won't say elsewhere, but the tendency in the United States to focus on personalities as the key here. And I would suggest, if I have a thrust to what I'm saying, that's not what we have here. We don't have a failure to communicate, and it isn't because we have interesting people in Beijing, Pyongyang, and Washington. They are interesting people. But absent those interesting people, we would find that the independent variable is that structural change. And that's what we need to manage. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes, very, very interesting remarks. Let me move to Victor next. I think I just thought that it's a bit unfair, having gentlemen from the United States 3 in a row, and then China and Korea. I was tempted to change, but I stick with this because it's already prearranged. So let's move on. Here from the United States 3, and then China, and finally South Korea. Thank you.
Well, great. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me first join the chorus of people that want to congratulate Chairman Che on the establishment of the Che Institute for Advanced Studies and Ambassador Park In-guk for bringing us all together and leading this, this very important research effort. I thought the conversation yesterday actually was one of the highest quality conversations I've heard in quite some time on the question of U.S., China, and Korea trilateral cooperation as well as challenges. So thank you to both of you for this. So this morning, in the short time that I have, I want to organize my remarks around this upcoming summit in Hanoi, because it's difficult not to think about it. But I'd like to offer two different sets of remarks organized around this Hanoi summit. The first of these, in consonance with the theme of the panel, East Asia and Transition, is the question of what are the not geopolitical, but the geo-economic opportunities that can be unlocked by the summit in Hanoi. And my second set of comments are then, what are the challenges in Hanoi that have to be overcome in order for some of these geo-economic opportunities to be unlocked? So on the first of these, in terms of geo-economic transition, as you can see from the map, at CSIS we have been working on a project looking at the the railway systems and the railway crossings in North Korea. Obviously, the biggest geoeconomic opportunity that could be unlocked with a successful summit and successful inter-Korean cooperation would be the effective reconnecting of the Korean peninsula to the Eurasian continent. I think many believe that, that such reconnection could be an important engine for peace on the Korean peninsula and for prosperity. It has the potential to create internationally compliant North Korean behavior. And it is a form of economic interaction between North Korea and the rest of the world that may have the least deleterious effects on North Korean society, to the extent that the North Korean leadership wants to insulate the society from, for lack of a better term, too much capitalism. In other words, inter-Korean railway cooperation, Eurasian Korean railway cooperation offers rents for North Korea that do not have the same sort of impact as opening their markets to all the vulnerabilities of being in an open market system. So having said that, let me just say a little bit about some of the work that we're doing here, and I'm only going to show you this in one of the slides. This is what you see up here is essentially all of the 5 railway connections that currently exist on the Korean peninsula. There are 2 between North and South Korea at Panmun and Dorasan, that you can see there on the bottom, and then on the east coast, Gamho and Jeojin. There are 4 links between China and North Korea. Sinuiju and Dandong, which is by far the most developed of these. But there are 3 others, as you can see, along the border with China. Mapojian, Namyang Tumen, and Changsu, and Shanghai-ko, right? And then there is one between North Korea and Russia, and that is Tumangang and Kasang at the very top. What is that? The northeast corner of the peninsula. These links are all developed in relatively. They have all been developed at relatively different levels. There is a general compatibility among China, North Korea, and South Korea links, railway links, in terms of the gauge that is used. They use similar gauge. 85% of North Korea's railway system uses a 1435 millimeter gauge, which is the same gauge that South Korea uses in China. Russia uses a completely different system than China, North Korea, and South Korea. And one of the reasons why we're looking at this, and if you could go to the next slide, that would be great. Or maybe I can do that. Let's see. So one of the reasons we're looking at this is we did a survey of over 200 South Korean government officials and experts, asking them what were key issues that they thought about when it comes to unification. And over 70% of the respondents said infrastructure was one of the key issues that they would think about when it comes to unification. So in addition to doing analysis of the specifics of reconnecting this, we are also, as some of you know, we've been doing a lot of satellite imagery work, mostly on missile bases, but this is some satellite imagery work that we've been doing on these inter-Korean connections. And the main point here is that, and this is relatively recent imagery from November, but the main point here is that even though there is compatibility in terms of gauge, there is a lot of work that needs to be done to make these operable railway connections in terms of a number of different specifics that I can't go into here. But one of them you can see very visually is that the level of development on the southern side of each of these crossings, when you compare them to the northern side, you can't even compare. There's the northern side of all these crossings are terribly underdeveloped when you compare them to the south. So here you can see the Panmun. Well, is there another photo here, or I think these may be the only two that we used, right? They're just these two. But we have you can go to the Beyond Parallel website. We have close-ups of the Panmun rail facility. You can compare it to Dorasan, as well as the other connections, and it's just horribly underdeveloped on the North Korean side. So the point here is that there is tremendous opportunity, geoeconomic opportunities for transitional economies in Asia that can be unlocked by positive outcomes in inter-Korean negotiations, and of course the Hanoi summit coming up. So let me just now turn to that and offer to you what I think are 5 very important questions that need to be answered in this Hanoi summit that can take us towards the possibility of realizing geoeconomic opportunities like the railway connections. So the first of these challenges is how to come up with results from this meeting in Hanoi that move forward far enough so that the diplomacy looks like it is producing credible results, but at the same time does not give up too much that undercuts U.S. alliance equities. Right? So how do we achieve outcomes that are meaningful in the Hanoi summit that push the process forward and give people confidence that the Trump-Kim diplomacy is working without having to sacrifice too much in terms of core alliance equities? The second challenge, and this is in no particular order, is how is it possible to negotiate over nuclear weapons, denuclearization, and North Korean missile capabilities in a way that doesn't lead to decoupling of long-range strategic threats to the United States from short and medium-range threats to South Korea and to Japan? The third question or challenge has to do with the timeline. And here, I think the question really is, how does one come up with a timeline for denuclearization that meets the political requirements of the American president, but at the same time is realistic from an expert perspective? People like Sig Hecker have written that they believe that true denuclearization of North Korea could take upwards of 10 years. President Trump doesn't have 10 years. At most, he has maybe 1 more year before the campaign starts in 2020. So again, the point is, how does one come up with a credible timeline for this that at the same time is politically acceptable, but from an expert perspective is realistic? That's a big gap to try to close. The fourth, I think, question or challenge is how to interpret, how should we interpret what North Korea offers? Should we interpret it as an opportunity or a trap? So a simple example here is North Korea, in its New Year's statement, offered to put a cap on fissile material production and a promise not to transfer weapons or material in the future. How are we, whether that's the United States or South Korea or China, how are we to interpret those sorts of offers? Do we interpret them as opportunities to move the process forward, or do we interpret them as essentially an attempt to gain acceptance for North Korea as a de facto nuclear weapon state, right? As basically a pledge to be a de facto nuclear weapon state. And then fifth and finally, the fifth challenge, I think, is what is the price for peace? Are the United States its allies in China willing to accept peace for partial denuclearization? Is the price for peace, again, alliance equities? I think this is a very core question that needs to be answered before we can sort of head down this road of accepting a peace agreement or a peace declaration on the peninsula. So to sum up, I think that there are a lot of tremendous opportunities, and in this particular case, geoeconomic opportunities for transitional economies in Asia that couldn't be unlocked with the Hanoi summit. But at the same time, there are some very important core questions and challenges that we, meaning the United States, Korea, China, Japan, and others, need to think about or answer in unison if the diplomacy of Hanoi is going to succeed in unlocking the sorts of opportunities that we look at in terms of things like the railway connections. So, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Actually, later I would like to hear from you your answers to those questions that you raised. Not all 5, but some of them. Then Mr. Bruce Bennett from RAND, please.
Thank you very much, and as well as the others, I appreciate Chairman Che and President Pak for scheduling this conference and inviting my participation. I noticed we had 3 Americans on this panel, and I figured giving you another American perspective may not be exactly what you need, so I'm going to try and twist this a little bit. I'm going to give you an American perspective of what I think the North Korean perspective is. Because so often we seem to think about the future from a US or a South Korean perspective, and we're not trying to think about what Kim Jong-un is looking for and where he is heading. Now, I could be wrong. I don't have incredible evidence. He's not a good friend and someone I sit down with. So I'm going to, though, give you my views. If I could have the next slide, please. I think we have to ask, first of all, what are Kim's objectives? Is his objective really only regime survival? Or do we need to take his New Year's Day addresses in the recent several years seriously and say he's not just interested in survival, he's also interested in unification. And that is not unification under South Korean control. It's unification under North Korean control. That's what he's thinking. Well, if he's interested in the first one, I would argue that his interest in nuclear weapons has got to be pretty limited. He's looking for a retaliatory capability that would allow him to impose punishment, not unlike the US assured destruction kind of concept in the Cold War. And if he has that, he's probably got a way of deterring US action against him, not counting his artillery threats and so forth. But let me ask, between 1953 and 2015, when Kim Jong-un probably started to have an ability to deliver nuclear weapons, how many times did the United States attack North Korea? The answer is, of course, 0. And so, did he need nuclear weapons to prevent an American attack on North Korea? The answer is, not historically. What changed in 2015? Because if something didn't change, the argument that this is only about defensive purposes doesn't make sense. And we need to move on to other kinds of reasons. What if he's interested in unification? Well, if he's interested in unification, the first response you get from most Americans and South Koreans is, he's never going to get there. He doesn't have the capabilities. That doesn't necessarily seem to have stopped him from doing other things. And so I think we have to ask, what does he see as key thresholds to accomplish? I think he wants to see a US disengagement from the peninsula. I think he wants to be in a position where he can put significant pressure on South Korea. And I think he needs to solidify his internal support. Why internal? you know, when you get a lot of capitalists in a country, like North Korea has grown in recent years, they have different interests. And because they can bribe officials, they've got different power. And Kim doesn't necessarily like that. At least I don't think he does. And so the question is, how far can he allow that to develop? And how does he maintain support among that group, including arguably his current efforts to get sanctions relief, because those are the people who most want it. All right, so let me look towards the future. What are some of the kinds of things that could happen in the future? And I'm not going to talk about all of the possibilities, but let's say that the future is driven by the denuclearization effort. Well, he could agree to do what he's promised to do, or he could decide to keep stalling and not proceed. What are the potential implications of that? Well, looking across just three dimensions, politics, information, economics, if he keeps stalling, if he makes an agreement, many ways we think of the movie that President Trump showed at Singapore. My problem with that movie is, as I looked at it, I said, if I were Kim Jong-un, is that really the future I want? Do I want information flowing readily into North Korea from the outside? Do I want to empower my capitalists in North Korea? What is it I really want? And I think we need to ask more about that. Alternatives that he could go to. He could go to unification-driven future, where he leads unification fully, he controls all of the South and the North, a shared situation, a case where the South leads, or some kind of confederation where he gets South Korean support. In terms of the risks associated with that, I think there are lots of risks in those different paths, lots of reasons for believing one or another. The worst risks are if he allows a South Korean-led unification. I don't think he's got a future in that. But in the others, he has some interesting possibilities. And the question is, what does he think he can do? What does not matter is what we think he thinks, or what we think he can do. What matters for him is what he thinks he can accomplish, because that's going to drive his actions. So if he goes in these directions, all right, there we go. We have to ask, what are the implications for the region? Well, first of all, with North Korea, I would argue we can't guarantee that the North is going to stop building nuclear weapons. My best guess is in 2018, the year of peace, North Korea increased its nuclear destructive potential about 70%. That's not peace. And while Kim Jong-un wants a peace agreement, let me ask you, is he also going to stop the Cold War on the peninsula? Because what about his indoctrination against Americans? You really teach nursery school students how to bayonet American soldiers, and that's peace? Not in my mind. And so it seems to me if there is going to be some end of war agreement, it's got to end the broader war and lead to a real condition of peace as opposed to the appearance of peace. I'm not sure we can get there. I hope we can. I'd certainly prefer if we can. But I think we need to be thinking about deterrence, as we were just talking about as well, because I can't guarantee he's going to give up his nuclear weapons. I think he could still suffer significant instabilities. As a class of capitalists grow in North Korea, how stable is the country? We don't know. It is a risk. I would also argue there are various issues here for South Korea. I think South Korea needs the alliance for the long term. I think it's stabilizing for the peninsula, both relative to North Korea and more broadly in the peninsula's area. I think, however, South Korea's got to decide on that on its own. South Korea could decide that North Korea didn't give up their nuclear weapons, therefore the South needs to have some. Those are potential problems with the alliance that we need to be thinking about and working on resolution. And those things could also lead to instability, some of which is already existent in South Korea. What about more broadly in the region? As I look at the countries in the region, you know, I think from a U.S. perspective, the U.S. needs to be doing some rethinking of the Us-Rok Alliance. We've agreed to an OPCON transition. That's probably a good thing. But does that mean that we don't tell South Korea about our nuclear weapon planning, as has been the case for decades? I think that doesn't make sense if we no longer have command. So there are aspects of the command that need adjustment if the alliance is to continue, and the U.S. has got to have a more robust strategy. We shouldn't be building military bases like Pyeongtaek, like Camp Humphreys, without nuclear weapon protection built into the design. Doesn't make sense. What about the other neighbors? I think China faces a real North Korean threat. I see Chinese military forces exercising all the time. I think the reorganization of the Chinese theaters so that now the northern theater poses a potential threat not only to North Korea from the north, but also from the west. I think those are messages that if I were North Korea, I'd be looking at. And we know in 1993 when Kim Jong-un, or when Kim Jong-il responded to Kim Il-sung's question about what do we do if we lose a war, and Kim Il-sung said, I will be sure to destroy the earth. What good is the earth without North Korea? That China was not excluded. And so we really share a lot of interests in common with China, the US and China, about this nuclear weapon threat and should be working more on it. Go to Japan. We've got an awful lot of friction now with South Korea and Japan. That's not a great way to go into the future. We need to get resolved. And North Korea could cause a whole lot more friction. And from an American perspective, I would argue with Russia, if I can get the slide to come up, oftentimes we look at Russia as a spoiler as opposed to a partner based on its actions. I hope it can be a partner. I hope that can change. So we talked briefly about the fact that we may need to deal with the nuclear North Korea over the long term. If you do that, you've got to understand the nature of the threat. And then you've got to be able to say, what can we do about the different parts of this? Now, South Korea has already independently established many elements. For interdiction, a kill chain. Active defense, Korean air and missile defense. To go beyond that, for retaliation, Korean massive punishment and retaliation. These are already part of South Korean unilateral doctrine, but also in many ways among American unilateral doctrine. We need to be prepared to work these issues. We also need to be thinking about the right-hand side, about how we act differently. But a part of this is, with nuclear weapons, waiting until nuclear weapons go off in terms of the focus for your deterrence is not a good idea. We need to be focused left of delivery, and that raises some instability questions, as with the kill chain, as with Korean massive punishment and retaliation. I think in many ways the four key parts are the ones that I'm indicating in red here. Improving intelligence, making clear our retaliatory threats, focusing on North Korean command control, and being able to operate in such an environment. And I'd be happy to talk about this more in detail. I'll stop there and say thank you, Mr. Chairman, for the opportunity to speak.
Thank you very much. Now we move on to the experts from China. Zhang Tuosheng is the chairman of the China Foundation for International and Strategic Studies. I think that you have a lot to say.
Today, Professor Chen Dongxiao should have sit on this seat, but he suffered a serious flu, so I replaced him to say something. so I will give a speech very briefly. So I'd like to share 3 points with you. First, I'd like to talk about the current Northeast Asia situation. I think last year, in recent years, the Northeast Asian region has undergone major change. Some of them are positive, some of them are negative. Firstly, the Korean Peninsula's situation has relaxed, and there is a rare historical opportunity for us to realize the denuclearization. The North Korea has put forward a new strategic line, and all the countries resume talks and improve relations. Among them, the most dominant development is between the South and the North, China and the North Korea, and the US and the North Korea. And 2 years ago, the risks of war and the military conflict was very high, but now has greatly decreased. And the process of denuclearization has restarted. Of course, the outlook remains highly uncertain. The second change is that the maritime sovereignty and the maritime rights and interest disputes in this region has decreased. China and Japan has resumed dialogues, and the community mechanism in the air and at sea has taken effect. The crisis management has greatly strengthened between China and Japan. So I still remember in 2014, so a lot of people said the situation in Northeast Asia just like that before the War I. So people have so much concerns that there would be a military conflict between China and Japan. Now the concern has disappeared. Of course, the problems are still over there, but it's under control. This is very important. On the same time, the Russians and the Japanese are also keeping talks. I hope they can make progress. The third change is it's not a big change about the region's security architecture. So I think because Trump's administration's big uncertainty, it has brought about some problems to the mutual alliance, not just on the U.S. South Korea alliance, but also on the U.S.-Japan alliance. But the basic situation has not changed. On the other side, the multilateral talks and the cooperation remains still developed very slowly. It's not good. The good news is the Trilateral summit, China, South Korea, Japan, the Trilateral summit on FTA has resumed and make progress. The fourth change is the major power relationship. I think it's very difficult for USA and Russia to improve their relationship. Someone said they are in the new kind of Cold War. So that's very bad. Although China-Japan relations has resumed has gone back to the normal track, but China-US relations has deteriorated. US has regards China as the main strategic competitor, And yesterday we have a lot of talks about that, so-called trade war, and also the frictions in the South China Sea and the Taiwan Strait has continually increased. It's very, very bad. So my second point is about China's policy on North Korea, Northeast Asia. In facing of the new development and the change, I think China's policy, the basic policy has not changed. But we have something new. China's basic policy towards this region is to maintain the peace, stability, and the development. It covers 4 aspects. The first is about Korean Peninsula. China, everyone knows China has a basic policy, 4 basic policy on Korean Peninsula. The first is denuclearization. Second is peaceful development. The third is to solve the problem by peaceful talks. The fourth is China strongly oppose any chaos and military conflict and war. But now China added one thing new. That is, we strongly support North Korea to realize their strategic transition. I think China believes it's in the interest of China, South Korea, North Korea, and the whole region. Secondly, China will continue to devote itself to building the East China Sea into a peaceful, friendly, and cooperative sea. The focus now, the policy focus now is to continue to strengthen the crisis management mechanism and develop code of conduct and the CBM. So if we can solve all the disputes, there will be a long way to go. But now, what we can do is just strengthen the crisis management. The third is about the nuclear security architecture. China insists on developing the multilateral talks and the cooperation in this region. But at the same time, I hope all of you can understand and to pay attention is that China has taken a more pragmatic attitude towards the military alliance. So now China think, in the past we always said the military alliance is a legacy of Cold War. It should go away. But now China said the military alliance will exist for a long, long time. So the multilateral talks, cooperation, and the military alliance could coexist. And we just hope the military alliance can decrease the confrontation, increase the transparency, and play a constructive role in the region. Then fourthly, I think China will put more efforts on to realize a stable and balanced major power relationship, especially to stabilize the China-US relations, to avoid so-called new type of Cold War. This is the most urgent diplomatic task for China. Here, I just want to say one thing. A lot of people have concerns about China's policy to develop its military forces. But I just want to tell you, China's defense policy is still defensive. And since 1988 till now, there's no any military conflict between China and any other countries. So this is very different from United States. You can see after the end of the Cold War, U.S. have so many conflicts and even war with other countries. My third point is that I hope the Northeast Asian states can have more overlaps on their strategies in face of the new situation. Here I have 4 proposals. First, Northeast Asian countries should strengthen the coordination and the cooperation to seize the opportunity to support North Korea to realize their strategic transformation. That's very, very important. So, joint hands to realize the full denuclearization and establishment of a peace regime in the Korean Peninsula. The most urgent task for all of us is to find a pragmatic roadmap. Now, that's very, very important. Secondly, the second proposal is all the countries should try their best to strengthen the difference management and crisis prevention and crisis management. And we need more COC and CBM in the northeastern area. It's not just only for to further relax the situation in the maritime disputes. Also, it will be helpful for managing the hot spots in the Taiwan Strait and maybe in the Korean Peninsula. The third proposal is all the countries should try our best to have more multilateral talks. For example, in the near future, maybe we can have 3-party talks, 4-party talks, and finally we can resume the 6-party talks. We can't just depends on the bilateral talks. Bilateral talks is very important, but we need more multilateral talks. And at the same time, we should try our best to resist and oppose unilateralism, trade protectionism, nationalism, and populism. It's the common task for all the Northeast Asian countries. And we should try our best to strengthen economic and cooperation and the non-traditional security cooperation. Finally, I think we should try our best to stabilize the major power relationship in this region. All the major powers should try our best to keep talks, especially between China and the USA, and strengthen the crisis management. Try our best to continue our cooperation. The small and the major power should, I hope they will not take sides. They can play a very important role and contribute a lot to help to stabilize the relationship between the major powers. Only when the major power relationship go to stability will the regional stability remain stable. I know to some extent all those proposals are very idealistic, but I still believe only when we can take this kind of a common strategy and a common policy can we seize the opportunity, overcome challenges in the transition of Northeast Asia, and eventually usher in a better future of the Northeast Asia. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Our final speaker is Professor Hyug Baeg
Thank
of
you.
Korea University.
Thank you. First of all, I would like to really thank 최종현 Institute and Chairman Chae-tae-won for inviting me to this very important inaugural conference. On my part, I would like to talk about power transition in Northeast Asia in the era of post-globalization. As you know, the era of globalization started with the Ronald Reagan's speech in 1987 in front of Berlin Wall, tear down this wall. So with that, after that speech, Cold War started to end, and the era of globalization has begun with borderless world. However, neoliberal globalization generated highly unequal society and thus aroused resistance movement against neoliberal globalizations. In June 2016, the middle and low-income workers, white in England, succeeded in passing Brexit bill, and in November 2016, white workers in Rust Belt states elected populist, nationalist, nativist Donald Trump to the president. So with the passing of Brexit and the election of Trump, world has entered in the era of post-globalization. Policy regimes in the era of post-globalization are very different from those in the era of globalization. The US President, Donald Trump, the advocates, nativism, nationalism, America first, populism, that are quite different from the banners of globalization, open borders, internationalism, engagement to alliance, and neoliberalism. Current, Trump's build the wall on US-Mexican borders symbolize anti-open borders policy of globalization era. Having said about the emergence of post-globalization era, I would like to talk about power transition in Northeast Asia, particularly Chinese challenge to US hegemony and United States strategy of responding Chinese challenge. US-China conflict for hegemony is the test case for power transition theory in the 21st century. Reading Thucydides' History of Peloponnesian War, Graham Allison warns that United States and China may fall into Thucydides' trap, that is, when a rising power causes fear in the hegemonic power, then the escalation toward the war become inevitable. However, I think for the time being in the future, the war of power transition between rising power, China, and established hegemonic power, United States, seems neither imminent nor inevitable. The reason is that, first, even though China had become a regional hegemon, China has not yet grown enough to compete global hegemony with the United States. Second reason is Trump and the United States has well prepared for hegemonic competition with China and try to prevent power transition to China. And first, I would like to talk about China's challenge to American hegemony. China's Xi Jinping declared in 2013 that China rose to a great power that can make global standards. And she announced that from now on, China will form a new model for great power relations with the United States. To realize China dream of rising to great power, Xi Jinping argued that China must develop military, economic, soft, and network power. In September 2013, Xi revealed an ambitious project of One Belt, One Road as the key to realize China's dream to become a great power by interconnecting China to everywhere in the world. And the One Belt, One Road would function as a global military economic network to reversely encircle so-called Dean Acheson's Great Crescent of the United States, which has contained China by offshore military defense line from Middle East to India, Southeast Asia, Philippines, Taiwan, Korea, and Japan for the last 70 years. So, and for the American side, to prevent power transition, U.S. President Trump chose a realist offshore balancing policy or strategy in Japan and Korea. According to Mearsheimer's offshore balancing theory, among three key areas that the United States has vital interest and station American troops are NATO, Middle East, East Asia. Among these three, U.S. can withdraw troops from NATO and the Middle East, while U.S. cannot withdraw its troops because the strategic value of key allies in East Asia has increased dramatically as China rose to hegemonic competitors to the United States. So, U.S. forces stationed in Korea and Japan not only have defended Korea and Japan themselves, but also played a key role to deter the power transition to China. Therefore, United States has to station its troops in East Asia and should not withdraw its troops. So the realist Trump has sought cost-sharing pass-the-buck policy to Korea and Japan. With the burden sharing of cost of stationing American troops, U.S. can maintain strong military presence and can effectively respond to the rise of China and the provocation from North Korea. And second, it pivot to Eurasia. As China's Xi Jinping has constructing One Belt, One Road that interconnect the whole Eurasian continent, stretching from Atlantic to South Pacific by continental and maritime Silk Road of 21st century, Obama's pivot to Asia or rebalancing strategy turned out to be too narrow to contain Chinese global network that covers the whole Eurasian continent. So in order to contain China and preventing power transition, Trump transformed American grand strategy from pivot to Asia to more inclusive and outreaching pivot to Eurasia that include Indo-Pacific. Trump renamed Pacific Command into U.S. Indo-Pacific Command, and the U.S. Pacific Command will be the command post of Indo-Pacific Security Diamond of United States, Australia, Japan, and India. Indo-Pacific Security Diamond was purported to counter the Chinese sea lanes holding the vast Eurasian supercontinent. And third, the since the 2018 last year, Trump has tried to tear down, 155-mile-long barbed wire fences that has divided North and South Korea more than 70 years, while he had trying to build 1,951-mile-long wall in U.S.-Mexican border. By denuclearizing North Korea and tearing down 155-mile inter-Korean fence, Trump tries to open socialist North Korea to the capitalist world and put North Korea under the sphere of influence of the United States. Trump expects that by opening inter-Korean border, Korean Peninsula can play the role of security buffer against the Chinese challenge to American hegemony. For the last 70 years, North Korea has played a key role of buffer state protecting China from containment from hegemonic country United States. Now, Trump, by ending Cold War in Korean Peninsula, put North Korea into the sphere of influence dominated by the United States, and by opening inter-Korean borders, both North and South are expected to play the role of guarding U.S. security interests from the Chinese challenge to American hegemony. Last December, end of last year issues, special issues, journal Economist reported that in 2018, that year, last year, three-man bromance flourished among Donald Trump, Kim Jong-un, and Moon Jae-in. Three-man bromance will continue in 2019, but unlike the bromance in 2018, three leaders in 2019 are expected, to achieve more substantive and tangible outcomes, such as the declaration of the end of Korean War, peace agreement, or U.S.-North Korea diplomatic relations, lifting or elevating sanctions in exchange for complete denuclearization of North Korea. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have heard from 5 experts. Very interesting. But I'm almost failed to manage time. We only have 15 minutes to go. So let me do it this way. I have a couple of questions from the floor. I mean, realistically, we will not come up with a new strategy, by the end of this session. So we can continue this talk, instead I will pose some questions to you. One is, I think obviously, Professor Cha, you raised several questions. I would ask your answers to, let's say, whether denuclearization could be possible without decoupling, without harming alliance. So I would like to hear from you. And the second questions is about the clash of empire that Ambassador GALLUCCI just mentioned. And also, we had a discussion yesterday on new Cold War. Cold War is not just economic and military confrontation, as Columbia professor Robert Jervis defined it as clash of ideas, clash of ideologies, ideas about what best serve the improvement of human life, or Chairman Che yesterday mentioned the happiness of the life. So it's about the vectors of change, which model best serve the change and development, etc. In that sense, here's American model that we are very much used to. If we engage a new Cold War in the decade ahead, we will have to see China come up with that ideas. Now, this is an alternative ideas of what best serve the people at the moment, and what not serve the American, and what the American model will not be able to serve. So that kind of competition, how you think about the potential of China from Ambassador GALLUCCI and Professor Zhang and Chairman Zhang, if you would be able to come up with that question. And if possible, I think Professor Hyug Baeg is pessimistic. As I hear from your remarks, then do you have any additional remarks on that? And final is about North Korea. Mr. Bennett, you talked about the future in North Korea and their intentions. I was wondering if, what becomes of North Korea after denuclearization and peace treaty is signed? Professor Im said that Trump will make efforts to make North Korea into American group, but do you think that that would be possible? Will North Korea transform into a pro-American player or remain an ally of China? And will it fight against the American policy of counterbalancing China after peace treaty signed, and then we have a new Korean peninsula? That order again.
So
I'm sorry, we have only 10 minutes left, so maybe 2 or 3 minutes.
2 or 3 minutes. I'll try to fill that time. So I have one answer and one question. I think and the comment was made yesterday that if we are concerned about a Cold War between the United States and China, one of the interesting things is, as you said, Mr. Chairman, that there is no competition of ideology of exactly the same kind that we were used to seeing with Marxist-Leninism, and that ideology being spread around the world, and therefore the zero-sum game that a bipolar world suggests could be felt or manifest in confrontations where there was an adoption of this Marxist-Leninist ideology, whether it's in Southeast Asia or Latin America or in Africa or wherever. And that was a feature of the then Cold War. That does not seem like it's a plausible future for us, and I think that's good news. There is not an ideology of the same kind that I am aware of that motivates the thinking and people of China. It is a much more difficult and diffuse ideology, I think, for at least someone from the United States to try to explain, and I would defer to my colleague from China to capture that. But I don't think we are confronting that kind of ideological competition. I think the competition is in a way more geographically focused on the Asia Pacific. I think that we are seeing it manifest clearly in economic terms and in military terms, and less so in ideological terms. The question I had was really for Bruce, because I found the kind of way he drew us into this characterization of North Korean motivation to be seductive and appealing. But I wasn't sure whether, if I was to go off and do a negotiation with North Korea, that I would do anything differently. In other words, I mean, I've been caught on this for a long time. I don't have much, as Koreans like to ask if you're optimistic or pessimistic. I am cynical, I am pessimistic, but I'm a realist. I want to find out about the North Koreans, and I want to know whether you think there's something we ought to do differently because of that analysis, or just simply not be naive about our approach to the North.
So on the question of denuclearization and decoupling, so I mean, the answer I think is, for me, is quite simple. If decoupling is some aspect of denuclearization, then we are not approaching the negotiation the right way. In fact, we're probably defeating ourselves in negotiation, because if we end up for short-term denuclearization gains undercutting our long-term alliance foundation, then in the end we are not succeeding, quite simply. Can I, on the whole question of China and Bob, what Bob said, I had two reactions. The first is, and this is very much from an academic perspective, and that is, again, as we've discussed yesterday and today, there's been a turn in Washington, D.C. about how to look at the U.S.-China relationship, right? And Bob, in fact, is actually much more clear about where he's coming from on this than most other people in Washington, who can't decide yet whether it's a conflict of interest game or if it's just a coordination game, and we're not communicating, sort of thing. But the one comment I'd have there is that I remember 15 years ago when many people believed it was a coordination game and that the solution was to embed China in international institutions. Scholars actually compiled a whole bunch of data on how embedding China in international institutions makes them more compliant, right? And so I feel that what is missing in the current discussion about U.S.-China conflict of interest is nobody has compiled that data, in fact, showing that over the past 10 years, China has become more non-compliant. I think there's lots of anecdotal evidence to that effect, but somebody needs to, whether it can be a Korean scholar, it can be a PhD student, someone needs to compile that data, because that will be a well-cited article somewhere at some point. The second is that on the question of whether it's a Cold War, I agree, I don't think it's a Cold War, but I think it starts to feel a lot like a Cold War when China starts moving much more into the Western Hemisphere. When China becomes even more present than it is now in Latin America and in Central America, then for the United States it's going to look much more like a Cold War, because historically that has been, whenever foreign powers come into the Western Hemisphere, that has been when, for the United States, it becomes a very real competition.
New Cold War would be unlikely. The past Cold War would not be a clash of ideas, as you said. It more likely is a kind of clash of interest, national interest. So, China's, leader Xi Jinping is a strong, nationalist, and Trump is populist who, focus on national interest. So it is not the clash of ideology, but clash of the national interest. And the prospect of you said that the moderator said the prospect of U.S.-China finding compromise for U.S.-China confrontation. I'm pessimistic about the prospect. I think that two-country relations would be confrontational because the Trump, last year, the whole held, summit meeting in Singapore. Usually, North Korea participate international, conference such as six-party talks were held in Beijing. But Singapore, last year it was held in Singapore, outside of China.